Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on human rights and the future of democracy. Today is International Human Rights Day. We cannot be wishing anyone happy Human Rights Day because at least we in India have much to be worried about where human rights are concerned. At this webinar, organized by the Campaign for Further Stand, for the repeal of the UAPA, and for all those languishing in prison under the draconian UAPA, we want to welcome you and want to welcome our two illustrious speakers, Henry Tiffane and Tista Settleward. Tista has been at the forefront of the human rights movement, in fact, in India. She has been a human rights activist. She has been a journalist of tremendous repute. She has been writing. Just now, she has been formally editing the Communism Combat. Then now there is this whole portal, online portal called saprang.in. And Tista has been for her work in Gujarat and her other work for human rights. She has been recognized not merely in India, but all over the world. She is a Padma Shri. She has got the Nuremberg Human Rights Award. Without further ado, I invite Tista to give us and share with us her insights.
It is International Human Rights Day, so it is a marker. It's a marker that we need to meet. I would like to greetings to my colleague and fellow traveler, Henry Tiffane, who's unfortunately not keeping well, but that has not deterred his spirit and commitment to the values represented by the Indian Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Please take care, Henry, and we wish you a speedy recovery. Friends, I would like to speak particularly today when we are talking about what ails our democracy and what we are seeing. What we are seeing as a complete dichotomy. We are seeing, on the one hand, a completely disdainful government, a regime that doesn't seem to have respect for either the clauses or the métier or the values of our preamble or our constitution, whether it is chapter 3 or chapter 4, fundamental rights or directive principles of state policy. It seems to the regime appears to have no respect even for the fundamentals of what a democracy ought to be. But in stark contrast to what the regime is up to, look at what is happening at the single border and on our streets. And look at what was happening on our streets in December and January 2019, 2020. Look at what was happening in our streets when our workers took to the streets, when our young persons of the minority community, threatened by a discriminatory CAA 2019 and threatened NPR NRC, peacefully and creatively took to the streets. And as some commentator with great wisdom has told us, that a democracy is marked, or a constitution is marked, not simply by remaining the rights don't simply remain on the pages of the constitution, but are articulated by people on the streets. We are certainly seeing our constitution come alive with the farmers who are articulating a very unique and basic principle that 299 days intense debate in the Constituent Assembly gave us when we gave ourselves this constitution, which was in tune. It was happening internationally when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came in 1948. Our constitution, there was a first draft, 46, there was a second draft, and there was a final draft that Baba Sahib Ambedkar presented to the Constituent Assembly on 26 January 1949, enacted in 26 January 1950. His words appear prophetic. We remember his words. We remember Jyotiba Phule's words. We remember Frank Anthony's words in the Minority Committee in the Constituent Assembly. We remember Birsa Munda's struggle. We remember Maulana Azad. And we remember Basavanna, Kabir, Eknath, Namdev, Tukaram, and Savitribai Phule. Because I always tell students of history, and I believe myself to be a student of politics and history, that the rights of equality, justice, non-discrimination, freedom of faith, freedom of existence, freedom to speak and live with dignity, to have a dignified wage, and to have autonomy and livelihood like the farmers and workers of this country are asking for, are not concepts that were just imported from across the seas. Yes, of course, the French Revolution and struggles across borders inspired each other. And the letter that Jyotiba Phule wrote to Martin Luther King Sr., recognizing the battle against slavery in the United States, at that time North America, when he recognized the battle for a casteless society back home, certainly were inspiring each other. However, on this soil of South Asia, on this soil of what we call India today, the battle between the Shraman and the Brahman, the battle against injustice, the battle for dignity and non-discrimination is as old as people itself. And therefore, for anyone to tell us, for any retrograde force to tell us that the battle for human rights are not integral to this soil, do not know our history. Friends, I think 73 years down, 70 years down, Constitution, 73 years down after independence, what we need to ask ourselves that are we concerned as much as we should be about the abuse of both procedural and substantive justice? And what do I mean when I say that? I mean, we have a situation where 84-year-old Father Stan Swami, somebody very dear to us, sabrangindia.in, a news portal devoted for social justice, Father Stan Swami wrote on it often. He wrote about the Pesa. He wrote about the Adivasis of Jharkhand. And Father Stan Swami was a friend who understood what social justice and constitutional values were and are about. For an 84-year-old Stan Swami and an 80-year-old Varavara Rao, for a Sudha Bhardwaj and a 70-year-old Gautam Navlaka, to have to approach the court for the basic dignity that it should be given all political prisoners, leads me to ask a question. Of course, UAPA must go. UAP must be repealed. Of course, the NIA must be called out for what Henry was just telling us, that what amounted like an abduction of Father Stan Swami, not an arrest, not a formal arrest at all. But I want to talk about prison conditions. I want to talk about prison monitoring. I mean, do we have a system 73 years after independence? Can we call ourselves a civilized nation if our prisons do not give basic dignity of life to any prisoner, any under trial, all prisoners, all under trials? We are supposed to have a prison manual. We are supposed to have a prison monitoring system. All these things are supposed to be watched by the district magistrate, by visitors committees. The home ministers of governments need to be informed about this. And yet we see a bleary, dark, sinister nexus at work in our prisons, where the glare of transparency is simply not available. And I say this with a sense of responsibility, because for me, Maharashtra, Mumbai, Bombay are slightly more progressive regions. And if here in our prisons, whether it's Taloja or whether it's Athar Road, we do not have an open prison monitoring system, and if in our prisons, like a report today in the Wire suggested that there's a kind of caste system that operates within our prisons as well, whether it is Rajasthan or whether it is Tamil Nadu. And young Ajay, who was just an 18-year-old in 2016, is quoted as saying that he had to jump into pits of human excreta because only a Dalit under trial prisoner would be asked to do that. Nobody else. I mean, it's literally our prisons become the worst examples of our outside society, where we have manual scavenging being allowed in a country that should never ever allow it. And the government is an offender, private contractors are offenders, corporations are offenders. We have an Abolition of Manual Scavenging Act passed in 2013. We have every 5 days, one person dying who jumps into the sewer, whether it's an adult or a minor. And yet we have a society that doesn't want to actually demand that no civilized society should want anybody to go down into the sewers. But we don't demand that. I mean, we have our farmers. We have 100,000 farmers in this bitter cold sitting on the single border. And we have a regime and a government that doesn't have the grace to allow them to come inside Delhi and sit at Ramlila Maidan. There's not been a single minister who's gone to the single border. I mean, they're robust. They are from the Sikh community, which is proud, which also mans our borders, women's our borders, leads our borders. But there's also tragedy happening at the Singhu border. Every day, one body is being sent home to Punjab. 15 people have lost their lives in the bitter cold because they're having to protest like this. And yet we have a government who just is spending public money, inaugurating the new parliamentary complex, inaugurating this, inaugurating that. The kind of money spent on the first person in this cabinet's travel is something that is clouded in secrecy. And we just don't have an accountable government. We don't have a humane government. So what should we as human rights workers, what should we as the human rights movement be concerned with? I would like to say that apart from being concerned with the specifics of cases like Stan Swami, Varavara Rao, Sudha Bhardwaj, Gautam Navlaka, and Shoma Sen, all the people we've known and respected and worked and who have been caught up in this absolutely fictitious Bhima Koregaon case, Anantel Tumbe. Of course, we should humanize them and talk about them. Of course, we should talk about Umar Khalid and Sarfur Zargar and Gulshiva Fatima and all the others who are incarcerated because of the CAA, anti-CAA, anti-NPR and NRC protests. We need to humanize the people that this regime wants to dehumanize. But in addition to that, I feel we need to talk about the procedures, the failure of the procedural justice system in our country. Because I think it is the failure of procedure that leads to failure of substantive justice. And I think this is something that we as a human rights movement need to address. It's a challenge for the human rights movement that we engage in processes and not just make strong, powerful, one-time interventions. What are these processes? These processes, due process of law, just like the due process that Henry was talking about, that did the NIA follow due process when an arrest was undertaken? No. They simply went to Bagaicha, they went to Ranchi, and they simply abducted an 84-year-old person. It was not a legal procedural arrest. If Article 370 is scrapped without adequate political dialogue, it is not just a violation of constitution, law, and procedure, but it is also an abrogation of basic rights. Process becomes the punishment. Absence of adherence to due process is the grossest violation of human rights that we have seen. If CAA 2019 was rammed through Indian Parliament, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha on December 9th and December 11th, a year ago, 2019, it was not just a brute show of majoritarianism, moreover, a colored brute show of majoritarianism that has no respect for the bare bones of a democracy. It was also a stark revelation that our constitution can be abused and vilified by an ideology in power while the constitution on paper remains in force. The question, therefore, is that can we become a functioning authoritarian autocracy, even a theocracy, without an out-and-out amendment to this constitution? It's a scary prospect, but we are seeing this happen before our eyes. What is actually wrong with the CAA 2019? Why were there so many protests? Because for the first time, religion as marker was brought to distinguish between somebody who would be given a citizenship by registration or not. And then with the threat of that and an NPR, NRC, All India NPR, NRC, looking at the Assam experience, which we are closely involved with as CJP, you see that not just was Article 14, Article 19 and Article 21 violated, Article 25 was also violated. Article 15 gives me a right to be non-discriminated against by the state. Yes, the state can take positive measures to right the discrimination against marginalized section, but there cannot be a negative discrimination like CAA 2019 does and has done for the first time in the history of this country. A democracy, I believe, is as alive as the right to protest on its streets. And we've seen a slow closing down on this right, even before 2014 when this government came to power. Almost permanent invocation in many parts of the country, many urban areas, many areas of Section 144. So we are being told that you can't protest here, you can't protest there. If at all you want to protest, there are demarcated areas in the various states. So that was one progression. Passing laws without debate with civil society, with citizens, for whom those laws are being passed. Just look at these present laws, the farm laws. I mean, it's such an incredible or such a devastating example of the kind of misinformation that is being fed to the media day after day after day. I would all recommend that you see some of the stuff that's coming out from independent digital media portals, individual journalists who are doing explainers, who are trying to tell us that during India's first government after independence in the cabinet, when the planning commission was being debated and the facts and figures being put forward by the planning commission in parliament was being debated, and Ram Manohar Lohia had problems with the kind of figures that were being preferred by Nehruji's cabinet, the parliament debated for 3 or 4 whole days on the nitty-gritty of the kind of statistics that were being preferred. And finally, the planning commission had to accept that there were some anomalies in the figures. Why am I giving this example? I'm giving this example to show that a democracy is as good as not only what happens in the streets, but what different institutions of democracy allow within their portals. Because a democracy is not simply about elections. A democracy is not simply about winning elections. I won't go into just now how elections are won. I'm not going to go into just now about how much money is spent by which party in power. I'm not going to go into account about the electoral bonds issue, very relevant issue. Who is paying the different parties for their elections? Which were the parties that supported anonymous electoral bonds? Why did the 2 major parties back anonymity in these bonds? These are serious questions for a democracy. Because if I need to know, just like I've said about electronic media channels and media channels, that we need to know which are the oligarchs, which are the corporates that are actually funding some of these media channels. We need to know, just like the transparency procedure puts in place how much a person owns in terms of finance and money when they contest an election. Surely we also need to know what are the nexuses involved when you are kind of steadily misinforming people, whether it's your electronic media channels or other media channels. So I think a very moot question is that a democracy is not simply about winning elections. A constitutional democracy is also about honoring even the opponents of the winning party in an election. And that is something this regime does not understand. That even if they had won and got 535 or 540 seats, they would need to listen in the value of the Indian democracy to the 3 parliamentarians who were not from their party. But no, they believe that a brute majority is what they have and therefore they want to push through an anti-constitutional agenda. So coming back to these 3 farm laws, which to use the word reform for them is an anomaly, because the farmers themselves are telling us that leave us with our autonomy, leave us with our land. We do not want to be reduced to mazdoor of the corporates. We do not want to become victims of corporate contract farming. We know that even today only 6 or 7% of farmers are protected by MSP, but there is dignity in the business that others do because they can decide what they want to plow, they decide what they want to do. There's autonomy of choice and they own the land and they own the business. The moment you allow rapacious corporates like Adani and Ambani, and we've seen the growth of these corporates in tune with how the BJP came to power and stayed in power in the state of Gujarat. We've seen Ambani grow, and now we've seen Adani grow in the last 15, 17 years into kind of some spectacular wealth. And it's very important to see, therefore, that how today these, the same channels will tell you that the fact that the Prime Minister of this country travels in private aircraft, not in the Indian Air Force aircraft, it tells its own story. The whole geo advertisement, all these things are out for everybody to see. But do we see, for the first time in this country, it's the farmers of this country, 60% of India is agrarian, 60% of India depends on the agrarian economy. The agrarian economy was the only economy that did not go into a loss during the COVID lockdown pandemic economic collapse. And they are telling us that, listen, leave us with our autonomy. And if you're passing laws for us, talk to us before you pass them. These laws with amendments will not do. Now, should a democratically elected government not be concerned about talking to the farmers, the community for whom certain laws are passed? Similarly, for the Indian working class. You have suddenly, in the period of this pandemic, you have 4 labor codes being passed, which are completely nullifying over 29 various acts passed over a period of 150 years, which actually preserve the gold standard for workers' rights: 8-hour working day, safe living conditions, rest after every 3-4 hours, dignified wage, etc., etc. You and I know that, we know that 75% of the Indian working class is in the unorganized sector. And that is why India witnessed shame, between April and May this year, when a government that declared a kind of unthought out lockdown within 4 hours did not realize that you have 64 crore people of ours who are interstate migrants. 2011 figures say 45 crores. Estimates say that this has gone up to 64 crores out of a 134 crore population in this country. And the government had no clue that this is a fragile working place that this section of the population enjoys, their homes, on rentals, their health, their pay structures. None of these are guarantors like in the public sector or in the private sector, better private sector. So no, you did not think of them and you just ordered this lockdown, because of which from the end of March to early April, whole of April, May onwards, you see that people just started walking. People just started walking because all of us during the lockdown felt safer and better to be at home with our family. And so did the migrant workers of this country. And yet we are told suddenly that everything is fine and the migrant worker does not really blame this government for any lapse. We don't really know what that means, because today we are being completely blindsided by propaganda. But I honestly believe that the task for the human rights movement is to actually look at the social and economic rights of the most marginalized. And let's look at the fact that why does our migrant workforce not have the right to vote? Our NRIs have it, our armed forces have it as they must, our paramilitary have it, but why should our migrant workers also not be given the right to vote, whether it is through a postal ballot or the facility to go home to their places and vote? Why should the migrant not be given to vote? These are certain very, very key issues that we want to look at. So we are seeing through a spate of legislation, which is known as counter-terror legislation, but actually is national security legislation, quote unquote, UAPA kind of legislation, National Security Act, PESA, etc. We are seeing incarcerations of political dissenters, whom we call political prisoners. But let's not forget that amendments to the UAPA were brought in first in 2004, then in 2008, then in 2011, then in 2018. So it's been a progression. It's been a progression of bad law being brought in. And we saw a spate of the young Muslims in the period before 2014 also being incarcerated under UAPA. And today we are seeing political voices, political dissenters, young student leaders also incarcerated. So today we see an ideology which actually militates against the constitution, which is in power today, which wants to overthrow the constitution, making complete mincemeat of constitutional values by passing a series of legislations that are rank anti-constitutional. So whether it is Article 370 abrogation, whether it is the CAA 2019 and the proposed NPR NRC, whether it is these 4 farm laws, whether it is the workers' conditions code bills, all of these do not pass the test of constitutionality, in my opinion. And therefore, as human rights workers, as communities, as individuals, as academics, whoever we think we are, teachers, professionals, we need to engage ourselves and ask this question, that how do we together form alliances and mobilize to be able to recapture the space that is lost and expand the space that didn't exist before. We are at the moment positioned in a unique moment where the farmers of this country are showing us the lead. Literally, the farmers of this country are showing us the lead. They have braved the cold for 15, 16 days in North India. Delhi is very, very cold at this time. And they're telling the government that we are going to now take this to the next level. If you're going to ask for amendments and not repeal the laws as we demand, then we are going to take this to the next level. I'm not sure how this is all going to pan out, but I think we need to stand with them in every which way we can. We also need to look a little bit and see that how are the other institutions of democracy holding out, the Election Commission, our courts, high courts, Supreme Courts, and if we need to strengthen these institutions of democracy further, we need to take risks and engage with them. 2 states, Uttarakhand and Uttar Pradesh, have passed laws ostensibly against conversion, but basically aimed at attacking the autonomy of choice and freedom of and the privacy of men and women who might want to marry across communities and castes. They're known as the love jihad laws, but that's not what they're called formally. But they've been enacted with a mindset in mind, which does not really respect individual autonomy, freedom of choice, and of course, particularly view certain minority religions in a particular way. So that front has also been open. Already we've seen 5 or 6 couples being brutally beaten within the courtroom in Aligarh and other places in UP. So you're seeing law enforcement actually behaving in India, as in parts of India, as if we are a police state and not a democratic state. And yet we are talking about us being a $1 trillion economy. We are talking about being on the world stage. We see the chief executive of this government constantly tom-tomming Indian parliament and democracy, while actually every single aspect of Indian democracy and the constitution is being humiliated every single day. So we're living in a state of dichotomy. We have a chief executive who's not held a press conference for the last 6.5 years, and yet he enjoys the most friendly press that any chief executive or any government in this country has ever had. Harsh questions are rarely asked. If at all they're asked for a few days or a few hours, they quickly vanish under the PR machinery of the government, in which unfortunately the media is complacent, or large sections of the media is complacent. One example is what Amitabh Kant of the Niti Aayog slipped out, and he said a couple of days ago that there's too much democracy in India. And of course, thanks to Twitter and social media, it got banned. The entire thing got hugely criticized. And then we saw suddenly, whether it was ANI or PTI, suddenly removing any sign of that comment from their portals. We've seen that happen before in so many instances, when certain quote-unquote problematic stories about wealth of certain individuals, the wealth growth of certain individuals, the nepotism of certainly highly placed individuals appear, sort of squeeze through the printed pages. You suddenly find those pieces being struck down, pulled down. So it's not an easy situation. It is a problematic situation, but it's also, I believe, the most difficult situations are also moments of deep challenge. And I think the challenge for all of us, for the Christian church, for Indian citizens, for Indian Christians, Muslims, Hindus, is to build alliances with all the various communities that we see as the most marginalized today, come out of our fear psychosis and raise some of these issues. I also want to say that, for the Adivasis and the forest workers and the scheduled tribes of this country, many of them see freedom not coming in 47 or 1950. They say that we got freedom in 2006 when Hamara Jab Kanun Parit Hua Tab, which is the Forest Rights Act, the Scheduled Tribes and Scheduled Tribes Recognition of Rights Act of 2006. Again, a law which came not because any government wanted to give it, but because there was years and decades of struggle by the forest rights movement, the land rights movement, the Adivasi movement. And by the way, during British rule, the first revolts against British rule came from the Adivasi lands. 250 revolts that have been documented. We unfortunately don't read about these in history books, but they were the first challenge, because they saw that their lands, their forest lands, which they had nurtured for centuries without ownership or paper, actually were being completely captured by the British for their own commercial use, timber, etc. So therefore, the Forest Rights Act was brought. But this government, from 2015 onwards, has passed 4 laws to dilute that act. The National Highways Law, the Campa Ordinance, I've been told to wind up. I'll be winding up in just 2 minutes. And the EIA 2020 and the private mining law that has been brought in. So we are seeing Parliament being used to actually dismantle Indian democracy brick by brick. And that's the huge challenge for us. We need to reclaim this democracy. We need to reclaim our constitutional rights, and we need to do it peacefully and through building alliances with all the various sections who are affected by this extremely vicarious and nasty plan. Finally, I'd like to say that the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown period, we saw an intensified attack on human rights taking place with state agencies, but the schisms were there to see earlier. And my last example will be that of the hate discourse. The Dalits of this country have been victim of a very bitter hate campaign for centuries now, very insidious, which has relegated them to a certain place in society. When they try to break out, they're subject to brute violence. But the religious minorities over the last 25, 30 years have been subject to a very vicious kind of violence coming from a certain thought process. We all know who it is. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, this hate vilification, hate speech campaign only got worse. So whether it was a Tabligh ki Jamaat, Corona spreader kind of campaign, in which even quote-unquote respectable television channels got involved, or whether it is the campaign against Christians, it only got worse. So we have a huge challenge ahead of us. Can we somehow convince our Adivasi organizations and farmers organizations to also talk about hate, also talk about communalism? And can we also, as political rights organizations, where we are talking about civil and political rights, also talk about the social, economic rights of vast sections of Indians who are facing hunger, deprivation, etc. And last but not the least, I think we need to ask for a complete stop to manual scavenging. It has no place in a civilized democracy. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Tisa, for your usual very brilliant and erudite presentation. Henry Defane is an advocate and on criminal and human rights law for the last 37 years. The executive director of People's Watch. He is the National Working Secretary of the Human Rights Defenders of India, and also of the Asian Network of NGOs. He has many responsibilities on human rights, both, I mean, in India, in Asia, and all over the world. The first question is, maybe we can pose it to Henry. Judiciary is normally the last resort for a citizen. When the judiciary supports the government in power, a citizen is helpless. In this situation, what can ordinary citizens be doing? Henry, the ball is in your court.
Our business is to continue to be critical. We are not functioning. There is no other alternative for us. How can we remain silent? When the judiciary does not perform its duties, as has already been pointed out in detail by various instances, it is up to us to use various media. It is up to us to organize public debates with retired judges, solid lawyers who can come and show how the judiciary has failed. I think these debates have no longer to be remaining within the confines of the Supreme Court corridors, but have to be taken to people. And that is what I think many people have been doing. All those in the Taloja jail are people who spoke about that. So that is the way forward. Not losing hope in spite of all the circumstances for losing hope being there. I remember, and I think we need to draw inspiration from this old man at the age of 83. After when he was after his arrest, he asks, "Can that book that I wrote be published now?" That is the spirit. I mean, I'm so many years younger to him. I need to get that spirit more and more into me. That was what Stan said. So I think, and he always said that when he was asked on the 31st of September to come to Mumbai to meet the NIA chief, he said, "I will never go there. Never go there." And when he says never, it is never. And there is nobody, Cedric, you know him much better than me. He will not change. That was the man he was. So I think we need to continue to demonstrate, publicize in different creative manners, but we have to continue to do that. Cedric, you're muted. Cedric, you're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. Tisa, there is a question for you. There
Yeah.
are so many people aggrieved. Kashmir due to the abrogation of Article 370 and 35, farmers due to the farm laws, laborers due to the new labor codes, NGOs due to the FCRA law. How can we build, this was your suggestion, in fact, it came from Henry too, how do we build a grand alliance of Dalits, Adivasis, OBCs, farmers, minorities to make an impact electorally? Is it possible? Tisa, and if Henry wants to add, you're most welcome to.
Electorally will come later, okay? Electorally will come later, because my problem has been that we only think electorally. If you build alliances electorally and they don't mean anything on the ground, then these are fragile alliances. what we need to do. I mean, look at what's happening in the Singhu border. I'm going on talking about it, You already, they're building these alliances. I've never seen urban India so concerned about farmers ever before. Okay. And we must salute people from the left movement, from the Bhumi Adhikar, Hanan Mullah people, Sainath, Yogen Yadav. These people have been building these alliances for years. It's after they built it up for like maybe 10 years, 15. You remember the 2018 protest. Then you remember the 2019 when they walked from Nasik to Maharashtra. And I still remember Bombay is a very selfish city. I mean, it's a nice city, but people are self-contained. And I remember that everyone was saying, and they decided within 2 hours of a meeting that they will walk through the night so that the exam of the young kids in Bombay will not be affected. Because the whole concern with Bombay was कि हमारे बच्चे का exam का क्या होगा. And they walked through the night so they could read Azan Vedar. And Bombay melted after that, you see. So point is, this is the spirit we are seeing from our people. We've never reached there before. I've digressed a little bit. What I'd like to say is reach out when others have a problem. Don't wait for others to reach when you have a problem. If you reach out and try and understand what their problem is, understand what their violation of rights is. What are they talking about? What is the migrant worker talking about? What is the farmer talking about? What is the worker to? We don't know all these issues. If these alliances become lasting and meaningful, then nothing will break them. They will then transform. I'm convinced of it, whether it'll happen sooner or later. Eventually, it'll transform into a magical social alliance. It will. It has to. But it has to sustain. It has to be very dogged. It has to be not, you don't have to worry about the spectacular show, but just do the nitty-gritty of constantly concerned, constantly building alliances, And I think, and people understand if you're coming from there. And I think the church, especially given its organizational structure, given the fact of its amazing quality of service in very far-reaching areas. No, I'm saying this not just as a critique, I'm saying it with empathy. You're really in a good place to do it. But don't worry about your institutions, because in any case, with this kind of government, you can't do anything about it. If they're going to attack it, they're going to attack it anyway. So there's no point being worried. Just reach out. You have an innate sense of justice. Relate to people. Don't let fear govern you, because I think fear can only stop us. So I think, and there are intersectionalities. There will be problems. I remember when the Hathras thing happened, we held a protest in Mumbai, and any young Dalits saying that don't take over. Dalits should only speak for Dalits. All these things will happen. We should step back and let them take over then, but we should still be there. Okay. I mean, Henry's been through it. We've been through it during the caste and UN thing also. It doesn't matter. People need leadership. They should be given their own leaderships. But as long as our commitment does not waver and our commitment only expand, I'm learning all the time. Even after 30 years in the human rights movement, I don't know it all. I believe I'm learning all the time. And with all the critique of the courts we are doing, I think on December 2nd, if the Supreme Court of India and the Madurai bench of the Madras High Court can pass stellar orders on custodial torture, I can look at it both as a positive sign and a negative sign. Negative why? Because 24 years after DK Basu, I'm still being told that there should be CCTVs in my police station, because the police station is a hellhole, because there's no transparency. On the other hand, at least that has happened, So it depends on how one looks at it all the time, Sorry, I took a bit of time.
Yeah,
I just need 2 minutes at some point to talk about Assam further study, because I forgot to refer to
Okay,
it.
yeah, definitely. We have two questions from Inigo Joachim. Okay, maybe Henry can answer them. What else can we do to make our rightful voices heard by the authorities who are hardened and deaf? And the second question, which in a way is complements the first question, it is high time to change the jail manual prepared by the British government. How do we change it, and who will do it? Henry, the ball is yours. Henry?
Sorry, I had
Yeah.
We also need to understand that there are people, organizations, institutions over the years who have developed expertise in certain areas. And I personally believe that if somebody has an expertise developed in a particular area, we should allow them to lead. We should learn from them, and move under their leadership. It doesn't mean that if they don't come forward, we just sit back and say, no, they were doing things. No, it's not that. But whatever good has been done, acknowledging more and more people only helps us to build these alliances. And therefore, on prisons, jails, all matters related to prisons, there has been a lot of work that has been done by the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. Now, we might have 200 other things that we want them to do. We can tell them all those things, but push them, get materials from them, and then work along with them. In all my TILs, which I have been forced to intervene in relating to prisons, I've always gone to them, and I've found that we have got some good responses and advice from them. So, as Tista said, alliances have to be built on a daily basis, and this is what will reflect as elections come closer to us. That was the that was the lesson we learned in 2019 in Tamil Nadu. 2 years of work continuously with different forms of alliances reflected itself in a complete different form at the time of elections.
Wow, questions are flowing in. Thank you, Henry, for that. This is Tutista from Arun Lobo. Media and judiciary are supposed to be our pillars, but they are not doing their job. How does one bring about change? In a way, you'll have answered it, but if you want to say something, Tista, you're most welcome.
No, I would say, first of all, on media, I'll say before I come to judiciary, that media, I'll say that please support those who are doing a good job. Because I think that's where we fail. Among all those who are not doing a good job, there are at least 8 or 10, I don't want to name them, but I can name them separately if you want, who are actually swimming against the tide. These are individual journalists, they're small collectives, they're not just the wires and the Sabrang India and the scroll. I'm talking about language. I mean, look at the Punjab agitation. It was Punjab channels, local channels, who actually brought out the reality of the farm protest so that the other channels were forced to cover it. So let's also make our honest choices. Why do we still run after the guys who are sold out? It's also our failure. So I think one is choose the people who are actually trying to do an independent job. And in your small way, please put your money where your mouth is and support them. Number one. Number two, judiciary. There are problematic trends. I'm not denying it at all. And we've spoken about it all the time. And we will go on speaking about it. But unless you engage with the judiciary and keep on engaging, you will not have a course correction. Okay. And when you have this engagement, which is constructive, it will give you the right also to make a couple of criticisms, and those criticisms can be made in the best spirit of a Democrat, not just to malign X or Y or Z person. There may be transgressions, as we saw in the Prashant Bhushan case, which was really idiotic, but there may not also be. So I think my recipe would be engage with the judiciary. Most people don't want to get into courts, and I can understand why, because it's demanding, long drawn out. You have to have solid documentation, all of that. But I believe we need to engage more with the judiciary, lower judiciary particularly, engage with them, and also then reserve your right as a citizen to make constructive, not destructive criticism. Ask for a repeal of the Contempt of Courts Act. That also should do with the campaign.
We have a question from Malcolm Nazareth, Dr. Dabolkar, Comrade Pansare in Maharashtra and others, similarly murdered in Karnataka, have not yet received justice. Anand Patwardhan's movie Reason has shown that. What may Christian churches do? So this is one question. The other question is from Julius Tudu, basically to Tista. Ma'am, do you see that the international community is not much vocal about gross human rights violation in the country? Is the international community wanting to play diplomatic escapism?
Apart from Dabolkar, Narendra Dabolkar, Pansare, it was M.M. Kalburgi and my dear friend Gauri Lankesh who lost their lives. She was a very, very close friend. And the fact that we saw these brutal killings and the fact that in this country, it takes so long for such individual killings for the killers to get prosecuted, itself tells you a tale. It itself tells you a tale of a system that is corroded from within, problematic, delayed. There's so many things involved. What can we do? What can the church do? Never give that case up. Just like Anand took the trouble to make that outstanding film called Vivek Reason, he's done his job as a filmmaker. We need to keep talking about it, observe the anniversary, make demands for justice, maybe go to court when the cases are being heard. Because I remember when the Best Bakery retrial was being heard, and within the first 5th or 6th week of that retrial, unfortunately, the star witness, and I don't blame her at all, she was made to turn against me and my organization. The fact that every day in court, along with me, there were 20, 30 other human rights defenders, activists sitting in the court, gives you huge moral courage to fight. We need to make that effort. They need the support that we go to the court and sit when the hearings are happening. Whenever we can, galvanize people locally, write letters to the media, start campaigns on social media, observe dates, so that, and more often than not, what were the things about Kalburgi, Gauri, Pansare, and Dabolkar that actually bothered the fanatics? Talk about their work, disseminate their work. I think that's what we can do. At least let's do what we can, is what I'm saying. And the second question, what was it? Yeah, the international community. I mean, Henry would be very well placed to talk about the international community, given his engagements all the time with the international human rights platforms. But I'll say this much, that it's always a toss-up, because India is a huge market. India is a huge market, apart from being the world's biggest democracy. And let me be very frank, that even before this regime came to power in 2014, it's had a very powerful mechanism to not allow human rights within India to be articulated at international fora. It's always been like that for a long, long time. So we need to continue our gentle advocacy in the other direction, saying that, yes, please talk about growth and the right kind of growth and climate change and our Adivasis and our farmers and all of that. But also, please constantly talk about human rights. So talk about our prisons. Ask the question that why should Stan Swami have to go to court to get a sipper? I mean, what was the jail superintendent doing? Why did Gausam Navlaka have to fumble around for his glasses? I mean it's pathetic. But Indian society also needs to feel shame before the international community feels shame. And I think there's not enough of us in India who are feeling shame about what's happening in our prisons. So we need a lot of homework at home as well. 2.2 million people in Assam, 1.9 million NRC, and the rest from doubtful voter and declared foreigners. 2.2 million people out of a population of 3.1 million have the specter of statelessness. 2.2 million plus their families have a specter of statelessness hanging on their heads. Individual cases, we are fighting those cases, but individual cases cannot be a solution. There has to be a judicious political solution to this. And this documentary test of citizenship, we need to stop it, make sure it doesn't start in the rest of India, because the state has spent 1,600 crores in Assam, and individual families have got impoverished over 3 generations trying to just provide the state with documents. It's pathetic if I tell you the stories. It's unbelievable. Even during the pandemic, the Assam border police was sending notices on WhatsApp so that people were running around trying to prove that they are Indians. It's a pathetic situation. So please, CA, NPR, NRC all over India will come, because I frankly believe this government really has nothing else to offer these people. So let's not lose our guard, and let's ensure that the political opposition is prepared to oppose it in every way possible, given the Assam experience.
Good. Thank you, Tista. Thank you, Henry. Let's hope that we can reclaim our democracy. Let's pledge, as Henry was reminding us, that we observe Human Rights Day not merely only on the 10th of December, but on every single day, and pledge that we bring human rights to the poor, to the marginalized, to the suffering, to the manual scavengers, to the Dalits, to the Adivasis, to the women and children, to the excluded of our country, and do all we can to restore what we are in a very calculated manner losing, because the country is ours. We have to stand up with with our heads upright, with our hearts full of zeal and passion, and to say that this land is our land and we will never let it down. Thanks to the constitution we have, thanks to the fact that we have some elements of democracy still existing. Thanks, Tista. Thanks, Henry, once again. And thanks to all our participants who are present here today.